Well, welcome to module number 5. Now, where have we been? A bit of a recap again. We've talked about data and how we use that to know the students. How assessment is along the way is all about the data collection to inform the next step of teaching, and it's topped and tailed with a preset test and a summative task at the end. Last week we had a look in Module 4, had a look at a couple of strategies in a little bit more detail. And it was how can we influence the range of content that we have particularly. And we looked at tiering at the 3 levels of content you might have, and also scaffolding and how you'll scaffold and extend and use that tool or a group of tools that are called scaffolding as a teaching strategy. This week we'll have a look at other strategies and how we can frame what we do in terms of the process of teaching and organising your classes. So first of all, I've introduced a new concept that you might like to use in terms of your academics justification. And that's universal design for learning. And that was particularly started to talk about with people with disability and particularly or profound learning needs. In other words, how we represent information, how we action and get the students to do, and how students will engage with information. They suggest that you should have different modes of representing information, so it's multimodal, different ways students can engage with things, how action and expression is the outcome or the product that you want students to do. Great video to watch, and it actually you can see, as in the left-hand side, there are similarities and differences between what we've talked about, the domains of differentiated instruction and the UDL framework. Quite useful to have a look, and I think you can take it quite simply, some key ideas from that moving forward. Have a look at these videos. The differentiated instruction in a primary and a secondary context. Now, it's not blank because there's nothing there, but it's embedded in here. So, it talks about differentiated instruction in a high school. So take and make notes and say, well, what could maybe that's just some ideas I could take forward. Again, we're going back to our program here, having a look at a diamond, most in the middle, but you'll need extension, you'll also need extra support. So we're looking at process here. So at the higher end, increase the number of options, the complexity of options, and the number of tasks. So it's both a quantum issue and a depth issue. And on the extra end, extra targeted resources. So you're decreasing the number of options, and what you're doing is targeting to the key aspects. So you're giving best practice or illustrative or key conceptual understandings. And you've got a range, of course, in the middle. So one of the key areas that we'll be doing is flexible grouping. Hopefully you're already using grouping in the classroom because you'll have part of your survey perhaps is ask the students how they best learn. And flexible groupings looks at the array from the individual through to the larger group of how you can organise that. We play a little activity. You can use cards to direct students into groups. Now you can have directed groups. In other words, you're teaching, you design the groups. It can be free choice groups. The student pick whatever they wish to, or it could be a combination in between. It could be group of boys, group of girls, mixed ability, and so on. So the homogeneous, same, and heterogeneous, different groupings. And it's a fit for purpose, dependent on what you want it to do. So this was a table about what are the positives, what are the negatives, and what are the interesting things about grouping. And what's come up often in this is about behaviour. If a student's picking out a group they like, you might have a big bad combination of students together. So there's a degree of you taking responsibility for grouping and students taking responsibility. Group work, here's a little video talking about that, the summative. He's got a few videos about some simple little snapshots of teaching strategies that you might want to consider. Not a bad website to go through. Your text speaks fulsomely about grouping and how it is important to have in a process of teaching a strategy. And I suggest you will use groupings as one of your key areas because it's about collaborative learning. And collaborative learning opens a whole world of opportunity and understanding. So the acronym we're using is TAPS. total class. You'll have in your total class, you'll be watching a video for the whole class, for example. Alone, where you're doing practice and reinforcement, perhaps. You'll have students working alone. You'll have the pair share type model, or working together, collaborating and evaluating, some peer sort of group work, and small groups. And small groups are that 3, 4, 5 type one, where you'll be clustered on a choice activity. There might be 3 choices. Okay, all the students with choice A here, B and C, or it might be, as we said, based on ability, could be based on interest, could be based also on just a social context that you want to achieve. So here's lots of websites that you might want to have a look, QR code or websites about flexible grouping and the importance and it undertakes to actually build learning and capacity. Now, you don't want to, have you ever sat in a classroom just in rows and it's all about you, a teacher from the front, and you're just doing your own work? Well, that's not a great learning environment, so it speaks to learning environment. But the process of grouping is a differentiated teaching strategy, because when you surveyed your students, perhaps you found out that some have more social construct to learning. But but also similarly, there's some who also want to work by themselves. So across your day, across your week of lessons, you make sure that you're meeting their learner needs, and therefore you're differentiating what you're doing to meet learning needs. That's differentiation. Going back to those things there. A little activity for yourself is, and pause and write down. If this was what you're going to do, for example, a concept introduction, what would be the best TAPS mode? Total, alone, pairs, or small groups that you think that? Now, there may be that there's more than one answer to this. So going through and see what things. So pause the video, going to show the answers or some suggestions shortly. How would you do it? Oh, it didn't. Let's go back. Oh, I thought I did. Here's a video that talks about cooperative learning in the secondary context and the benefits of it. Here's another process activity. That's learning stations. So if you're in a primary context and you've got your own room, great. You can have a reading corner, you can have maths corner, science corner, or you can have a topic in maths, or a topic in science, or a topic in reading, and you can have some sort of theme. So notice here you've got an IT sort of hub, and then you've got a discussion hub over there. So creating a learning station meets the different learning needs. Now they could be rotating in learning stations often. So they do one activity for a certain team. They could be there for the day in terms of so you're doing a maths activity. For today's maths, this is your learning station. Tomorrow, you'll do a different learning station. So you're catering and differentiating for learning needs based on students' preferences. Learning stations, here's a bit of a graphic about how you can do it. There's some interesting things you can create learning stations on their readiness level of complexity in their learning process or mode of engagement, or on their interest. And they can, as I say, they can be rotating or they can be fixed. Centres, very similar to learning stations, where you've got those different areas in your classroom, and it can be again by rotation. It can be remediation, for example, too, or extension, for example. Cubing, little strategy you might wish to do. One student did this, had one of those big cubes and was in a preschool context. They roll the cube and they have a question. And the question talks about the topic. And what's the answer of cubing? Small strategy, not a big strategy, but you have different layers or levels of questions perhaps. More complex questions in some instances, simple questions in some, questions that broaden their knowledge or deepen their knowledge. And here's some information about how you could do that. Here's some examples of it for different learning contexts that you could do. So it's really one of those engagement activities to get students into the learning, or you could use it as a review activity. I suppose you could use it in the explore phase too. So here's a little activity. So we are now looking at the process here and coming back to here. And that's what we've talked about today. So increased depth and breadth and complexity in the product. And also similarly a decrease. So across a lesson or across a unit of work, what are you asking the students to do? How are you modifying what you want them to do based on their readiness, based on their interest, based on their learning profile. And here's some product opportunities. In other words, does the student always have to produce an essay or do an exam? Is it okay, would the student meet the learning outcomes and the objects of the lesson if they did these sort of report, or they did that, a kinesthetic, a model, a dance, a performance, a drama? Instead, could they produce something, a speech? Could they create something in a visual sense? So here is a tool that allows different products, and that's, for example, learning menus. And there's some quirky things here that, your entrees and some main course. So if students have choice, you're going to get more engagement. If students have choice, you can be creating for their interest. Or choice gives them opportunities of a learning process, for example, a song, Facebook, do a quiz, do some photo montage. So in other words, there's opportunities of choice that might match the learner profile of the student. Here is another little snapshot of perhaps what they could do in terms of choice and produce. So a couple of little options there. This is a tic-tac-toe or choice board. And it's designed around the multiple intelligences. So in other words, here's a topic, put it in the middle, and you have to do, that's your output. You have to, whatever the topic is, create a poem. Whatever the topic is, make a game. Whatever the topic is, create or play or do something. So some of this is going to work really well, some topics not so well, but you're giving choice and you're engaging the student. So differentiation isn't just choice, but it can be choice if it's got a purpose and intent behind it. So we revisit the science unit, and I do a little exercise for that. How would you do that? And here's something that I've tried at my school. Some schools are doing it. You can Google on those. It's the Bloom's and MI matrix, and it has a whole range of advantages. And what does it look like? Well, you've got all your Blooms across from knowing to evaluating, from simple to complex, and you have all the MI here, and you have them blended. And for example, in this, everyone has to do the green, then you have to make a choice of so many yellow, so many white, for example. And here is a slightly simplified, and the Blooms, it simplifies into 3 overall columns and so on. So, and what you also can do is you can actually put perhaps a spiritual connection across there, because I think that's something you have, a tool you can integrate. Don't want to go too crazy. This is something you won't do on PEP, but something you could do. In other words, this could be a unit of work, and the unit of work, the students have to do different aspects of choose, say, 10 out of these, or 2 red, 2 blue, different levels. And so the students go off and they're independent learners, and you are really their guide each day in roaming and checking and so on. So a different way of doing, perhaps to consider down the track. I concluded with this here. There's a YouTube video. It has 15 different differentiated strategies. You type in differentiated teaching strategies and you'll get a truckload of things to do. This one that I recommend. So, where's your application? Your application is that you will choose differentiated teaching strategies as a process and products alongside the earlier video. We're looking at content that you might do in response to readiness, in response to interest, in response to learner profile. That is everything. That is everything that Task 1's about, isn't it? Looking at the data, assessing it for readiness, interest, and learner profile, and then selecting a teaching strategy or strategies to meet their need. It is also the same thing for sections number 1, section number 2 in your GTPA. So we're now at a point where we say, okay, we've looked at data, we're thinking and analysing data, we're doing some therefore, and we've examined some differentiated teaching strategies. So you should hopefully now be in a perfect place to be submitting your first assignment.